Okay, my topic today is prophets, futurists, and soothsayers, which is a somewhat diverse group, not usually put together in one talk, which is part of what I'm trying to do. I'm looking at why people make long-term predictions and how we deal with long-term predictions. By long-term, I mean so long that you can't wait to see whether they came true or not, like predicting tomorrow's weather. Usually we predicting fluctuations in markets, we test them rather quickly, but sometimes we make predictions that are 10 years out, 20 years out, and we have to act on them to some extent before we know whether they came true or not. It's very important in terms of public policy. Public policy is oriented towards our expectations about the future. Academia isn't so strong on that. We tend to focus on the past because we have more certain knowledge about the past or the present. In the business world, they do some serious decision making based on their expectations about the future, investing huge sums of money, say in electric cars rather than gas-powered cars because of the predictions about global warming. So in the business world, it is generally taken more seriously. I like this diagram, so I picked that for my first slide, discovering that it actually comes from a astrology site, which is a very popular version of soothsaying, I would say, of pre-Christian sort of something rooted in religious belief about the stars. Almost completely without any evidence to support it. And usually it's not long term, it's usually they're predicting tomorrow. And even though it can't be shown to come true, they're usually so vague that you can argue that they did come true whether you believe it or not, or that you can interpret whatever happened in some way that it fits the prediction. And that's a big part of a lot of predictions, is being vague. This is a slide, a website called superiching.com about Chung Feng Li, a personal prophet of the first emperor of the Tang dynasty. This website claims that he made the most accurate predictions that ever existed. He had 60 poems and cartoon drawings, each of which made predictions, and all of them have been accurately fulfilled one by one. So that's a rather amazing claim that this person predicted the future 50 times in a row correctly. But let's look at one of them. Here we see one of his predictions. When the sun rises, everyone cries. The air of December is not good. South Mountain has a bird and the north has fallen. When the chicken makes a noise, the sun shall set. How can you say that this came true? How would you know? First of all, it seems that a lot of it is demonstrably false, in the sense that I've seen the sun rise this morning and nobody cried. There are birds on every mountain, I suppose, but the sun sets every night, whether the chickens make a noise or not. The picture itself doesn't help. So let's look at the interpretation. The sun represents the Empire of Japan. The air of December is not good. On December 9th, 1941, China declared war on Japan. Okay, the South Mountain as a bird means there is danger in the south. The north has fallen means Manchuria. So after the fact, the phrases are misinterpreted or reinterpreted to fit whatever happened. And this is a very common type of sort of mystical futurism that managed to prove that we knew what was going to happen. As a result of that, he makes a prediction. He predicted World War III, which this hit about 10 years ago, would have happened already. Hasn't happened, but he's quite certain that it's about to happen and how it's going to happen based on one of these parables. So it's a matter of, after something happens, you can make sense of it and explain what it meant. But let's switch and look at scientific prediction. This is a very well-known one, which is often talked about, The Population Bomb, a book published by Dr. Paul Ehrlich. Now, Paul Ehrlich is a distinguished scientist and a professor at Stanford University. He co-authored this book with his wife, but they left her name off of it because the publisher said books with two authors don't sell as well. He says the battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 1970s and 80s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash program embarked upon now. Nothing prevents substantial increase in the world death rate. So it's a very, very certain prediction that he makes. And this is the opening paragraphs of the book. It was rather sloppily put together. If you look at the diagram, there's a flaw on the cover, which people have pointed out. And I don't know if you can see the flaw anywhere. It's actually with the bomb, the picture of the bomb. It shows, it says the bomb is ticking, whereas it's actually a fuse bomb and not a bomb with a timer. Now, this book got a lot of attention in part because it's from a distinguished scientist. On the other hand, he's not a demographer. His area has to do with insects and their coevolution with plants. So he's an entomologist and apparently fairly distinguished in that area. And that is something you find where distinguished scientists will move out of their area and make all kinds of predictions. I did a book about Linus Pauling, who was making all kinds of predictions about vitamin C. Now, this prediction has a date, the 1970s and 1980s. It's not a precise calendar date, but it was pretty soon. And we know that it didn't happen. This is a graph from Smithsonian Magazine. You can see here the lines are death toll for Great Famine. And you see that death toll for famine went down remarkably just after the time that his book was published. And global population shot up and continued to grow. So we got more and more people and a decline in starvation. Most starvation that we see now has to do with political problems, mostly warfare and civil war, not with inability to produce food. So we had the whole green revolution, so it's wrong. So somebody makes a prediction, it's wrong. Well, what's striking about this is that nobody really cared that it was wrong. He got all kinds of awards. There's a list here on a critical website of the awards. Some of them are for his actual work in entomology, but many of them mention this book. And in talking about it, he considered the possibility that it might be wrong, but he didn't really care. He said, well, if I'm right, we will save the world. If I'm wrong, people will still be better fed, better housed, happier, thanks to our effort. So you see that the prediction was intended as to change policy. And if you lied a little bit or you got the prediction wrong, you're scaring people, that doesn't matter. One of his collaborators here, John Holdren, argued to put too much emphasis on the correctness or incorrectness of particular predictions is to miss the main point of writing usefully about the future. So his idea was that this was useful. It had an effect. It led not just him, but the general argument of the population bomb led to the one-child policy in China. So it had an effect on policy. Whether that was good or not is very debatable. Today, the Chinese sort of wish they had never done that because they have a elderly population, they have female infanticide. So if you want to talk about the impact of it, you can debate that. The fact that it doesn't matter if it's wrong bothers me. As a person who taught research methods for 45 years, I sort of try to impress on students that trying to be correct is important. What you do get is that these wrong predictions come back to haunt you. This is a newspaper clipping. from a right-wing columnist. Wrong predictions don't deter predictors. And he cites some of these older predictions. He discusses the population bomb at some length and says, these guys are wrong, they didn't have mass famine. Therefore, the people who are predicting global warming are wrong, and we shouldn't pay any attention to them. Doomsday predictions are being repeated in ways by John Kerry and his climate scientists. Will we resist or blindly follow? And he really twisted around. He has a thing where Kerry says, we have 100 days to make a change. He was talking about a meeting that was going to happen in 100 days. He wasn't saying there would be a catastrophe. But you have what we could say the boy who cried wolf problem, that if you keep making wrong predictions, when you make a correct prediction, you're not going to be believed. So that's a risk. Another one that is extremely influential was this limits to growth study, which came out, I believe, in 1968, talking about the fact that the Earth has limited resources and we're likely to run out of things if we don't change our policies. It had the advantage of coming out just at the time where there was the oil crisis caused by politics in the Middle East and an embargo by the OPEC countries. So people in the United States, and I think in Europe too, were having trouble getting gasoline. So it looked like they were running out. You got a big play by the United Nations. This is a quote from Hugh Thant, who was the Secretary General in 1969. If such a global partnership is not forged within the next decade, then I very much fear the problems I have mentioned will reach such staggering proportions that they will be beyond our capacity to control. And I find this is a common feature of disaster predictions, is that they predict a disaster in about 10 years. 10 years seems to be the average. This includes particularly predictions of Jesus Christ's return. You can go on the Wikipedia and find a list of 50 of those. People almost never say Jesus will return in 200 years. He's always going to return within their lifetime. And these crises will occur within people's lifetime, but they're not happening quite yet. So it's at least about 10 years out. Limits to growth was one of the first studies that used computer projections, making graphs such as the one you see here. This is from a later edition in 1999, but it sort of shows the trends in oil production. And you see oil production is crashing. The result of that is population goes up and then collapses. And when you see a population of collapse, that meant hundreds of millions of people starving to death. Food is not declined. The basic flaw in this is that they took the known reserves of petroleum and assumed, well, what would happen if that's all that we have? We'll never find any more. In practice, petroleum companies tend to prospect about 10 years out. So after about 10 years, the oil is gone, and then everything collapses. Play in the press, if you look at the New York Times, I saw one book speaker said it was on the front page of the Times. It was actually on the front page of the book review, but that's a prominent place for a book to be. If it doesn't blow everybody's mind who can read without moving his lips, writes Robert Townsend, the earth is kaput. So that's a statement. Now, this review also looked at World Dynamics by Forrester, who was actually the instructor of the people who wrote the Limits to Growth, Meadows, Donnell and Dennis Meadows. His book was very balanced. It said, well, this might happen, that might happen. We're trying a number of projections. We don't know which is going to happen. What the people in Limits to Growth did was take all the bad predictions and sort of twist things around to fit. Now, I mentioned that this was in the New York Times book review. I don't know how many people read the review. I made a mistake there. I clicked on the link instead of the show. Just a minute here, I'll get back to the right page. So I have embedded links in some of these things, and if you click the wrong button, you can do that. I did send them the slides, so you can get these slides if you want to follow up on any of these things. The review said the limits to growth is an empty and misleading work. Its imposing apparatus to computer technology and systems jargon conceals a kind of intellectual Rube Goldberg device, one which takes arbitrary assumptions, shakes them up, and comes out with arbitrary conclusions. That's a really very damning review done by some people who are highly competent in the area. So you can't say that there was a consensus of experts ever that this was correct. And this was, as they say here, garbage in, garbage out, which is something you can do with a computer model. If you put in the wrong data, you'll get the wrong conclusions. The consequence of this, however, was that people continued to believe it regardless. It didn't really, it had tremendous impact because of what was going on in the oil prices, which was caused by, everybody knew that it was caused by an embargo, not by the oil wells running dry. The authors to the book responded to this. This is from Dennis and Donella Meadows. And basically they concluded that it was a religious difference, a philosophical difference. There are two different concepts of man. One held by the advocates of indefinite growth, which is an age-old Christian, Judeo-Christian tradition, that man has the universe at his disposal, can do whatever he wants. The opposite is an ancient one, more related to Eastern religions, traditional religions, saying we have to adjust. So she's basically saying this is a philosophical difference. You can't really find an objective way of resolving these different views of man and his role in the world. It seems to be possible for either side to look at the same world and find support for their view. So they say, well, we are giving our argument, they're giving theirs, and it's all religion, it's philosophy, it's not science. In 2032, they published a follow-up. One reason I'm looking at these old studies is that we actually have follow-up studies that look at how well they came out. After 30 years, they did a follow-up study that sort of said, well, the collapse hasn't happened yet, but it's coming. We're overshooting. It's at that time, this came out right after the stock market crash in 2008, and they said it's going to be like the stock market crash. Everything's booming and then it crashes. Finally, in 2052, they did a follow-up study, which is, I'm not in 2052, it's 2012, but predicting for 2052. And this one abandoned the whole thesis. It said, no, we're not describing impending disaster. This is a long-term process. It can be controlled. Really abandoning the whole thesis. Didn't get much interest. The doomsday predictions tend to have much more impact. Let's look at why prophecies exist. I'm switching back now to the religious world. 10 reasons why prophecy exists. I got this from a religious website. It shows that God speaks the truth, proves that the Bible is God's word. And this is something you often hear. The Bible is the only book that contains genuine fulfilled prophecies that were fulfilled to the T. I don't believe that's actually true. I've been looking at the Bible a bit since I got into this project. Bible has all kinds of prophecies that didn't come true. According to Mark, Jesus predicted that he would return in the lifetime of the people listening to it, which certainly hasn't happened. And the religious people know that, but they still think there's prophecies that are true. It's also not a very impressive claim. I mean, I could prophesize that the sun will rise in the east, and I would be correct every single day. I would never get it wrong. If you make hundreds or thousands of prophecies, some of them will come true, and you just forget the ones that didn't. So that's what they tend to do. The reason for this is that it's a post-truth world. We have absolute truth in Jesus Christ and his gospel as a firm foundation on which to stand. God is our authority, not the CDC, not the Biden administration, not the World Health Organization, not the talking heads on the news. This is coming from Andrew Torba, who's the CEO of Gab.com, which is the free speech website that is trying to replace Facebook. They are dead set against vaccination. That's their primary cause today. And the fact of the matter is that the Bible says absolutely nothing about vaccination. So that whatever truths they have, Jesus didn't talk about vaccinations. They didn't exist. And of course, we've had all kinds of diseases, smallpox, the Black Death, over the centuries, and Christianity was always there. It did not come up with any solution, offered some solace to the bereaved, but modern science has come up with vaccines, and the Bible didn't. But they have absolute truth in Jesus Christ. This comes from the Bible. This is just to look at some quotes from the Bible. This is a prediction from Mark, which is one of the New Testament Gospels attributed to Jesus. He says, everyone will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds with great power and glory. Angels will descend, and there will be a tremendous darkening of the sun. The moon will give no light. The stars will fall from the sky. And this generation will not pass from the scene before all these things take place. That's interesting in that it has a actual time limit, and it did not happen. Nobody claims that it happened. There are various people who claim to be Jesus resurrected, but none of them have been accepted by any of the Christian groups. When they look at the predictions that have been proven true, this is from a Watchtower site. You're going to hear wars and reports of wars. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be food shortages. There will be great earthquakes. You see, none of these have a date. None of them give a place. And there are comments that anybody who was familiar with human history could predict that these things are going to continue to happen somewhere in the world at some time. And they're also contradicted in the Bible. And that the Bible has this one about wars, but it also has the Lord will mediate between nations, settle disputes, hammer their swords into plowshares, which is different and inspirational to many people. And of course, many believers take the Bible as inspiration, not as prediction, which is, you see statues at the United Nations and so on for this particular phrase, which I think is a better use of religious text than to say that they're going to predict the future. Why do people make these predictions? In history, we have a number. This is a guy named William Miller. He was an American Baptist preacher. He has an interesting history. He was a deist. He read Voltaire. He read Hume, Thomas Paine, many of the people who say, well, deism basically says God created the universe, but he doesn't intervene anymore. It's up to us, which is sort of close to atheism in the sense that you don't appeal to God to guide your everyday life. Then he was dissatisfied with that. He had a religious revelation. He was unhappy with it. And he decided that the Bible had to be the truth. But then he had to start looking at the Bible to make predictions, and started to study the text. And one of the things you can say for these religious thinkers that they are very studious. They do serious research. They spend years reading the Bible, trying to predict the future. And in his memoirs, he gives you an idea of his logic, which I thought was interesting. To understand doctrine, you take all the scriptures that impact on the prediction you're trying to make. And if they all agree, that's fine. If they don't agree, you figure on ones to ignore. And he has quotes from the Bible to say that. Cease to hear instruction that causes error from knowledge. Stop listening to teaching that contradicts what you know is right. That is clearly a part of people's thinking, is I only listen to the things that believe what I have, support what I already believe. Figures have a figurative meaning and are used in prophecy. And so you don't take them literally, which most biblical scholars would agree. When you talk about a monster with 7 heads and 10 horns, they think that really means 7 countries. It's a metaphor. It's sort of like Alice in Wonderland, where the characters represent political figures, but probably political figures of the day. There's no evidence that these prophets 2,000 years ago were writing about our century. They're writing about their own century. If a word makes sense as it stands, it does no violence of the simple laws of nature. It is to be understood literally, if not figuratively. So he went through all this analysis in 1818 and reached the conclusion that Jesus would return in 1843, which is a little longer than usual. Usually it's about 10 or 15 years. His was more like 25, but still in his lifetime. And he thought the Bible had proved this. And many, many people believe that. He had a tremendous following, and he lived until 1848, or till the date that he picked, 1843, and it didn't happen. And this is unusual. He actually admitted his error. I confess my error and acknowledge my disappointment. But I still believe the day of the Lord is near, but I can't really say when. This was known as the Great Disappointment, and many, many believers across at least the United States were disappointed. But this happens again and again. There's a guy named Edgar Weisenot, who was a NASA engineer, also went into biblical prediction. And he had 88 reasons why the rapture will be in 1988. And he said, only if the Bible is in error am I wrong. I say that to every preacher in town. The Bible proves it. If there were a king in this country and I could gamble with my life, I would stake my life on Rosh Hashanah 888. And the biblical chronologies are tied to the Jewish calendar. So they're looking at certain dates when it can occur. Didn't happen in 1988, believe it or not. The rapture is when the earth ends and the true believers are taken up to heaven and everybody else is killed. He did later books with later predictions. He kept going, but he didn't get many readers for his later books. This is another one. Harold Egbert Camping predicted Judgment Day in 94, 2006, and 2011. Following. Now, really, you see, this is a picture of a roadside sign. The Bible guarantees it. This is going to happen. Now, he was primarily a radio preacher, so he had a large audience on the radio. Radio preachers are still big in this country. I'm not sure how many people listen to radio preachers in Europe, but he had a tremendous following, gradually wearing down when none of the things came true. And it's still going on. They're still advertising books. This is an ad I got. Do you know that the Bible predicts the day when Jesus will set foot on earth? So then you buy the book, you find out they're actually a little more cautious in the book. It's going to be in 2027 or 2028. There'll be a 7-year tribulation. The rapture will be super imminent. If this next Jubilee is when Christ returns. If he doesn't make it then, we got to wait another 50 years for the next Jubilee. But this is this is a current prediction. I'm on a mailing list for prophecy.com, and I'm getting these all the time that we're approaching this rapture and the end of the earth, and all of the non-believers will perish, and only the true believers will be taken up to heaven. There are similar stories in other religions, which I'm not quite as familiar with, but in Europe and in Scandinavia, you have the Norse mythology of Ragnarok, however you pronounce it, which was a series of events in which the death of a number of great figures: Odin, Thor, Tyr, Freyr, Heimdallr, and Loki, multiple gods. This is also used for video games. There's a sequence on Netflix, a multi-series about a Norwegian town poisoned by pollution, which is inspired by this myth. If you go to Islam, they have the belief in the Mahdi, the Calypso of the future, who will rule for 7, 9, or 19 years, depending on who you believe. And then the Antichrist will appear. Then will Jesus Christ descend and lead Muslims in prayers. They incorporate the Christian scriptures into their tradition. And this will be after a period of loss of faith. And this seems to be a part of the psychology of these predictions, is that the worse things are getting, the more you believe that when it gets really bad, there will be a transformation. And then it'll go to what's really good. You can make an analogy to Marxism, in the sense that the class struggle gets worse and worse. Then you have the revolution, and you have the utopia of communism. I don't get into that in this talk, but Marxists are generally more skeptical about making predictions in time, contemporary Marxists at least, and tend to see the collapse coming for environmental reasons and not for class conflict. So there isn't much of that in the Marxist world today. This is not just one more example. This is a guy named Shoko Ashihari, who published a book declaring himself to be the Christ. He is a true multi-faith prophet. He combined Indian Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, as well as Hinduism, Christianity, yoga, and the writings of Nostradamus. Now, what's really of concern about this, first of all, he did get a large following, a sort of a cult following in Japan. And like many prophets, he's frustrated it wasn't happening and decided to try to bring it about with the nerve gas attack in the subway in Tokyo. So that's where he got known. You probably read about that, or those of you who are as old as I am remember when this happened. They tried to start it. As a result, he got arrested. He described a final conflict culminating in a nuclear Armageddon, which he got from the Bible. Humanity would end except for the elite few who joined which was his group. So he was arrested, put in jail. Another odd thing about him, he did not go on a hunger strike while he was in jail. He actually went on a toilet strike and refused to use the toilet and wore diapers the whole time he was in jail, up until the time that he was executed by the Japanese. I did not find any explanation of why he chose the toilet strike as a protest. You can draw a parallel on the left to this group, the Deep Green Resistance, which is also predicting catastrophe, in this case, an environmental catastrophe. They take all the worst environmental predictions and assume that they're true. What they do that's different from other groups is that they are taking action, and their action is to, I thought I had another slide for them. Their action is to destroy industrial civilization through bombings, through attacks, through a resistance movement. They look at options from nonviolence to guerrilla warfare and they conclude that the only thing they can do is destroy factories, destroy logging mills. They knock spikes into trees so that when lumberjacks put a chainsaw in the tree, it destroys the saw and can kill the lumberjack. These still exist and are deep underground. I have a friend whose daughter is one of these, and he can't even get in touch with her. She's totally underground. They have been pretty successfully suppressed in the sense that their actions have not destroyed industrial civilization, obviously, but they continue action despite the fact that this book is 2011 and the catastrophe is not happened as yet. I don't want to give the idea that futurists are really always the same as the religious prophets, because futurism does have a track record. Probably the most prominent is H.G. Wells, who's published a number of futurist books. Anticipation of the reaction of mechanical and scientific progress upon human life and thought. That's a long title of this book, often just called Anticipations. And he had a tremendous number of valid predictions, some of which are listed here. One of the biggest was suburbanization, steam railways, new motor vehicles. He predicted the class system would be, two-class agrarian system would be replaced by a four-class system, secularization, professionalization of government, a lot of predictions to do with war and technology and warfare. Smaller languages would die out. He thought English, French, Chinese, and perhaps German will become predominant. I just know I'm speaking now to a German group in English. So English has become very predominant for international things of all kinds. He predicted world government, but he thought that would take a long time. And he also got into eugenics, which is a thing that he is often criticized for. But he had a remarkable run based on technological predictions, looking at what was being developed in technology and saying, where is this going to go? What will the impact be? And I think that that kind of prediction has a pretty good track record. He also predicted something called the land ironclads, which he put in a short story. He's better known for his novels, but at the time, he was well known for an encyclopedia he published, which sold tens of millions of copies around the world, and a lot of nonfiction books as well. He predicted the development of the tank. Well, they didn't use the word tank. He called it the land ironclad. The technology was not quite what happened. His were larger and they had a number of wheels. They didn't have a track pad, but he had a real impact on the military planners, particularly on Winston Churchill, who became a good friend of his and looked at the prediction of warfare. Also, this was for the First World War, but then getting into the Second World War in terms of the war in the air. Another futurist who was remarkably prescient was Vannevar Bush. I'm just giving you a few of the highlights here. He was an engineer, science administrator. He predicted something called a Memex, which is a desk. You see a picture of it here. This would be a desk where you could sit at your desk and call up all the world's information and literature and get all the information you needed right in your desk, which he thought would use microfilm. So we had the technology wrong in the sense that it's digital today. Really, we have this today, and it's even smaller. I don't even need a whole desk. I have my laptop. I can pull up just about all the world's knowledge. We have Wikipedia. That's another prediction that Wells made, was of the global encyclopedia, but he had no idea of the digital technology, but he saw the need for that. So he came up with a number of predictions of technologies that were needed, that were going to be developed. Also the sort of communications technologies we're using right now, where I'm sitting in Ohio and I'm talking to people around the world. We take that for granted today, but it's fairly recent. Probably the most impressive futurist since Wells was Herman Kahn, who wrote a book called The Year 2000, published in 1967. I just picked 2000 because it was popular to view the turn of the century as significant. And he predicted the population quite correctly at the time, quite different from the population bomb. He made a number of technological predictions. These have all been evaluated now. There's serious studies of it, and they found that 80% of them were correct, although it's hard to say exactly how detailed the prediction has to be correct. He was not appreciated for his work. He was mostly denounced for another book on thermonuclear war when he looked at the impact of thermonuclear war, and saying that it probably wouldn't happen because you can't really use thermonuclear weapons to deter conventional attacks. But he was criticized by people who said, you know, that we could survive, that thermonuclear war had to be total catastrophe. The opposition in that sense was this Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and they have this famous doomsday clock. Doomsday is a symbol that represents the likelihood of a man-made global catastrophe starting in 1947, which had to do with atomic bombs even before the Soviets had a bomb. I'm always skeptical of this imagery because it can't always be 3 minutes to midnight or 2 minutes to midnight, and midnight never comes. They've now changed it. They're putting the climate catastrophe in as a part of it. They used to have it prominently on their cover. They've taken it down. I think the risk of nuclear war is still there, but we've gotten used to it. We don't think about it much. There is a novel 2034 talking about nuclear war between China and the United States, with 2 or 3 cities destroyed in each country, but not a Armageddon in that novel. Also, the Indians come in and mediate the whole thing and suppress both the Chinese and the American technology, which assumes Indian military technology greatly advancing from where it is now. This image of doomsday and midnight hits people. There's a number of books called A Few Minutes to Midnight. I don't think I put that slide in this presentation. If you think about it, what is midnight? Midnight isn't anything. When I was a child, I remember the first time my parents let me stay up to midnight on New Year's Eve. Nothing happens on midnight except people kiss, they yell Happy New Year, a ball descends on the Empire State Building, and you go on to 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. But it appeals to people, and they get a lot of press release whenever they move the clock. They move it close. So it appeals to this fear of catastrophe, which is out there. So these are what we call doomsday forecasts. And they have a certain, if you look at, as Jung talks about archetypes, there's the idea that a catastrophe is looming. You people don't see it. This can be proved either by scientific analysis or analysis of sacred texts or messages from God that come in dreams sometimes. Usually it will come in about 10 years, but before this generation is gone. And to prevent it, we must follow the policies I am advocating. This is an example, the Wormwood Prophecy, which is based on the biblical prediction of stars falling from Earth. He relates this to Apophis 99942, which is a asteroid that was detected by astronomers. There was a brief concern that it might hit the Earth. They later decided it wasn't going to. They're talking about this as the star Wormwood, and it will destroy the earth. And maybe this is what the Bible was predicting. The interesting thing about this book is that it has first and last chapters are fictional. And what happens is that this asteroid is coming. So the scientific authorities say, well, we've got to dig into caves and have shelters and protect ourselves. And they gave everyone a code implanted on their wrist to say which shelter they would go into. So they responded by trying to survive this. The religious people refused to take this, just as they're now refusing to get vaccinated. And they went up on top of a mountain to wait for God to save them. So the idea of this kind of prophecy is that you believe that the religion is going to save you from something. You don't have to do anything about it, which is similar to what people say about illness. People who don't believe in medicine or vaccinations, that it's up to God. I'll put my faith in God. Except that most of them, when they actually get something, they go into the hospital and put their faith in the doctors. I've done some speculation about the psychological roots of preoccupation with doomsday, and there is some theoretical literature on this. They're not a whole lot of empirical research as we have on conspiracy theories. I think it's harder perhaps harder to study because it gets into stuff that's unconscious. A part of it, I think, is guilt. People feel guilty and they think they deserve to be punished. It's fear that's caused by perhaps something realistic, wishful thinking, intolerance of ambiguity. And if you look at psychological theorists, you see some of this, historical theorists too. This is a book by Norman Kahn, The Future of the Pursuit of the Millennium. He looks at these movements throughout European history, and he said that they sprung up during times when there were famines, when there were pandemics, when people were frightened, people were scared because of legitimate things that were happening. Nobody knew what was happening. They turned to religion for help. And realistically, the physicians you had then really didn't have much to offer with smallpox or the Black Death. So he finds historically these movements cropped up when there's a lot of fear caused by some realistic event. This is an example, to throw another example in, of religious prophecy. This is a guy named Jeremiah Johnson, who's a prominent internet preacher. He had a dream on October 20th, 2020. But going back for that, he was one of the leaders who prophesied that Donald Trump would win the election in 2018. The original election that he won, or whether it was 2016, he felt that Trump was God's instrument, even though he was a person with a lot of personal defects and sins. Nevertheless, God was using them. On the 2020, he had a dream. He got 3 visions. The first was that the Los Angeles Dodgers would win the World Series, which was beginning that day. The second was of Amy Coney Barrett's appointment to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the third was of Donald Trump winning re-election. Now, these are sort of odd. I don't know of any religious thinker who believes that God is concerned about baseball teams and who wins baseball games. Amy Coney Barrett's appointment was almost certain to be passed because of the politics of it. So the only one that was really in doubt was Trump winning the election. It turned out that Trump didn't win the election, and he conceded that he was wrong and actually went on the internet. Let me see if I can show him talking here, if my internet's not too slow.
I was warned
Where is
about
your
people
faith?
like you.
You're a coward.
You are not a minister of the Lord.
Shame
How
on
dare
you.
apologize
Donald
for God?
Trump did
I
win.
know God's plan is for
You're a
Trump.
jerk.
You are a
He's
wolf
not.
in sheep's clothing. You're a coward,
This
you're a
apology
traitor,
disgusts me.
and I'm praying for your soul.
My life has been threatened. My world has been turned upside down. News agencies from around the world have asked for interviews. Donald Trump and the prophetic controversy, I was wrong.
Okay, you can watch that if you want. If you look at my website, there's a link to it, or you can search for his name. It's still up. He has abandoned this type of prophecy based on dreams. He thinks the Old Testament prophets did that, but after Jesus, we're just supposed to go by the Bible. And he's now teaching prophecy of Jesus's return based on the Bible. But the interesting thing there is that he was attacked not for being wrong, but for admitting it and for saying that he was wrong. And there's a whole debate going on in this community. Some of the preachers say, well, we were wrong. We must admit we were wrong. Otherwise, people are just going to laugh at us. Others are saying, well, he really did win, but it was stolen from him. He will get it reversed. So there's a whole debate about that. But that's something that's going on today. Freud has some arguments about guilt and why people feel that they need to be punished. In Civilization and Its Discontents, which is a well-known book, the idea that in civilization we are made to feel guilty for many of our urges, and we can either take this out by being self-destructive or by being aggressive towards others. So that's one psychological explanation of this idea that something terrible is about to happen. And it's because I feel guilty that I deserve to be punished, I'm going to be punished. That's one theory. Nietzsche, who's a scholar you Germans probably know better than I do, he talked about the price that men had to pay for reason, seriousness, control of their emotions. I think many of the ideas that Freud developed came from his work primarily. What a mad, unhappy animal is man. What strange notions occur to him, perversions, paroxysms of nonsense. So he says that those are coming from civilization that has required us to suppress some of our natural biological drives. Then you have the power of positive thinking, getting into wishful thinking, the belief that if you wish for something, you can make it happen, that you should have a positive view of the world. That's another thing that leads to catastrophe, then followed by utopia. You can jump across this chasm, which was the chasm in the Doomsday prediction at the beginning. Ambiguity intolerance seems to be part of it. The idea that people want definite truths. They don't want to say, well, this might happen, that might happen. So you get the idea that we're going to run out and it's going to be a catastrophe, a lack of petroleum, catches a lot more people than somebody who publishes a book that says, well, we don't really know what's going to happen, depends on this or that, there's different things. Unfortunately, that's the way the world is, but it's not satisfying to people who have the need of a truth. Now, one of the problems with predictions is you can't do a fact check in the way that we do for websites, in the sense that they haven't happened yet. So we have to use certain criteria to evaluate them. I think predictions based on ancient texts, dreams, star charts, etc., are only valuable for insight into psychology. I think predictions of apocalypse or utopia are something that one has to be skeptical of, that there's a tendency to exaggerate. You want to look at predictions that are open-ended. If they don't have timing, they're not really testable. There has to be some sense of the time limit. It doesn't have to be an exact day, but it has to be within the next decade, within 20 years. You want to be skeptical of simplicity. Prophets who demonize people who disagree with them say, this is the simple answer. We don't have to look at the complexity of the world. If you have a scientific and technological prediction based on a substantial consensus of physical scientists, engineers, technologists, it has a good chance of being correct based on the track record. I can't say that for us sociologists. Sociologists don't have a very good track record, other than the demographers. Demographers are pretty good at making predictions, but the other social scientists don't tend to be quite so have such a good track record. So you're not going to have a collapse. You're not going to just jump over it. You're probably going to have something less dramatic. This comes up with regard to the current issue, which is climate change and global warming. And many of the people who are skeptical of that quote a number of the studies that I've talked about. And there is an ongoing debate about how terrible it's going to be. I don't think people are denying it so much anymore as saying it's not going to be quite so terrible. We can adapt to it. I think that prediction is being accepted because things are already happening. It's not just about the future. So that's the main reason. There's also a consensus of serious environmental scientists, which there never was for global cooling. They'll talk about global cooling. Some people thought that might be happening. There was a debate about it. They decided that wasn't so likely. There was reason for it, that the pollution would block off the sun and cause cooling. But where you get a consensus and it's relatively balanced, it works pretty well, as opposed to the people who see it just as a hoax. This was good old Senator James Inhofe, who's still a senator. He thought they were just making it up based on their past track record, and because it violates his feeling that God determines what happens. So he also says that he never points to scripture in a debate because he knows this would discredit him. So he doesn't quote the Bible in public debate. Here we see catastrophism. You'll die of old age. I'll die of climate change. Jorn Lomberg, who's a Swedish economist, he's saying it's exaggerated. Climate change panic costs us trillions. We don't need to panic. The counter argument is if you don't get people panicked, they won't do anything at all. So you want to exaggerate it, which is what the current Secretary General of the United Nations is doing. There's more panic in his statements than there is in the statements, the actual technical reports. We had this with climate research 12, 13 years ago. Jim Hansen, who predicted the greenhouse effect, which happened, he predicted the West Side Highway would be gone in 10 years, it'd be underwater. He made a lot of doomsday predictions that didn't come true. I think I've talked enough. There's another clip here. There's a tendency to say that the apocalypse is coming. We have 10 years left to save the world. You get that from Joe Biden. President Biden warned the United States has only a decade to confront a global climate crisis. I don't really think there's any turning point in one decade. A decade is psychological, but we do need to confront the crisis, and we have to deal with it, and maybe politically that's the way to do it. Other things you have, like the crash of the Soviet Union, was not predicted by any of the social scientists who specialized in that. It was predicted by some of the activists, people who felt that there are people who were living there and who had that feeling, rather than people who were directly involved. Okay, I think I'm not going to show you any more slides because I've gone on for long enough. I'm going to turn off screen share and we can have questions, discussion, comments, open up to the group here.
Thank you for an entertaining talk, Ted. Just a quick question before I open the floor for discussion. Would you like to take a break, Ted, now? Like, do you want a 5-minute break, or should we?
No,
go?
I'm okay. I'm
Okay.
okay if everybody else is.
Great. Okay, so I'm allowing people to unmute themselves. Please, if you have questions, just write a Q or mark that you have a question in the chat.